Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Putnam, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director of the Concord Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Gross Award ceremony, which will be followed by our forum on Abraham Lincoln on the verge of the presidency. We're especially pleased this evening to bestow the 2020 Robert Gross Award for the advancement of Concord's history to Michael Goodwin. We will hear more about and from Michael in a moment. I should note first that this award was established by the Concord Museum in 2019 to honor an individual who has worked with the museum in our efforts to expand our educational programming to wider audiences and to make the history that our exhibits and educational programs chronicle more dynamic and inclusive. The award is named for Robert Gross, who more than any living historian has brought Concord's rich history to life. Bob is one of our trustees and an extremely valued member of our larger community. He's the author of the award-winning The Minuteman in Their World and the soon-to-be-published The Transcendentalists in Their World. If Ralph Waldo Emerson is the sage of Concord, then Bob is surely the bard of Concord and its iconic history. I should note that the award itself, which I will present later, comes in the form of an engraved Revere bowl and a copy of Bob's book with a personal inscription to Michael. Last month, the museum reopened its doors, so please do come visit. And I'm pleased to be here in the Churchill and Janet Franklin Lyceum with Michael and a number of his guests. We welcome you all. Since COVID restrictions limited how many individuals could be here with us in person, we asked Bob and last year's inaugural Gross Award winner, Maria Madison, the founder of the Robbins House, to say a few words virtually. Their brief remarks will be followed by a video that helps bring Michael's teaching and educational philosophy to life. So let's watch together now. Technical difficulties of the video.
First of all, congratulations, Michael. I'm actually honored by your receiving this award. The curriculum you developed strikes me as so close to the heart of what I did as a teacher and professor in all my career. First at Amherst College, your alma mater, and regret that we never had a chance to be there at the same time. But you surely picked up there and you communicate so well. The interdisciplinary nature of education, of how each subject, if it reinforces the other, from history and literature and art to science and mathematics, can lead to such great understanding on the student's part. The other thing I think you do really well is to focus on not the teacher, but the student and the empowerment of the student in learning. And so, you know, what I really admire about your curriculum is the way in which you take students out of the classroom and into the environment all around them to study science by looking at the rivers and ponds, walking in the woods, learning about plants, learning about chemistry, all at the same time that they're comparing that to history and literature. And the train is now going on behind me that Thoreau took from into the city. So they learn too about the practical environment.
I know the Robbins House organized in the wake of the death of George Floyd, a very powerful vigil that brought the community together. And I thought perhaps you could just share a little bit about what occurred there.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I have to give immense credit to both one of our newest board members, Nikki Turpin, who's also an educator, and Michael Goodwin, who organized this phenomenal event. And I can also share just a couple of those photos. And before our own event, the town as well held 3 protests, as far as I am aware of, to the day before our very own event. And I believe something like 200 people turned out at each of those 2 events the day before, and 500 people turned out for the Robbins House event. And it was exceptional for a variety of reasons. not just due to the size of the turnout, but also because of the testimonials that we heard. And it was primarily, I think, Concord residents and neighboring town representatives as well. But equally, I believe the head of the police, the head of the Concord department also spoke out that what we're all hoping for is equity, right? Fundamentally, what we're all hoping for is to understand how to redress a balanced and deep telling of America's history that includes Black contribution to the development of this nation. And so we had speaker after speaker go to the microphone to describe those stories, and it was truly a community gathering to promote that sense of community.
Great. Well, that's perfect, and we will share snippets of this conversation when we honor Michael again for his work, both as you just suggested, as a community activist and as his work with students through Rivers and Revolution. So, Maria, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, and congratulations to Michael as well.
The one problem I most want to solve in education is fragmentation.
All right, so if you all open up your reader, so the Maya Angelou poem.
We're trying to create an educational experience that's built on coherence instead of fragmentation, as if literature exists over here and mathematics exists over here and they don't speak to one another. Sets us up to then view the world in a fragmented way. The primatologist Jane Goodall, she has this beautiful moment where she says, the whole idea that we can study primates in the lab, no, you need to understand them in their natural environment, in their habitat, where they live.
That is your warm-up.
And the most toxic form of fragmentation is the disconnect between the human beings that comprise any school community.
We're this community, and when everyone's here, it works better. I can't be all I can be unless you can be all you can be. And that's what's different about this. That's coming to this class. That is the work of Rivers.
That idea of synthesis, of bringing things together. Arts are such a powerful tool, a synthesis tool to bring learning together across all these disciplines.
So we are taking an E. Cummings poem and we're creating devised pieces based around the text and saying it with different speeches, movements, and creating a piece of work in about 10 minutes.
I think the biggest thing that's possible in these kinds of spaces is being weird and being able to take risks. I was dyslexic my whole life in normal school. I hated it. I felt inferior. I felt stupid. I felt ashamed of who I was as a learner. I know that in these kind of environments, people will help you grow.
Everyone has interests, everyone has a story, everyone's coming in as a unique human being. And if you can create an instructional environment and a learning environment in which everyone can actually find a way in and has something to contribute. It doesn't look like what usual school looks like. We're not doing the same thing differently, we're doing something different.
There you go. Okay. Before bestowing this award, Michael, let me offer a couple other observations that inform our decision to pay tribute to you. In a separate conversation with Bob Gross, he compared the methods you used in your classroom to those that Thoreau brothers pioneered in their private academy here in Concord. And others have drawn the connection, both physical and spiritual, to the progressive educational philosophy of Thoreau's and Emerson's contemporary Bronson Alcott. Your work with the Concord Museum predates my tenure here. I read an interesting oral history recently, conducted in 2013 with some of your Rivers and Revolution students, and I was struck by the words of Robert Hoagland, who, along with a few peers, and as part of their required community stewardship assignment, were assigned to work here at the museum. My colleagues emptied an entire gallery and invited them to develop together and from scratch an exhibit on the history of schooling in Concord, based on the artifacts from the museum's collection. In reading the oral history, Robert's enthusiasm jumps off the page as he describes the experience as mind-blowing. School, he suggested, is all about theories, but we actually got to build an exhibit. I really didn't think I was ever going to do anything significant in high school. Most kids study the material, pass tests, and then forget about what they have learned because it's not relevant to their lives. But I developed a real exhibit in a museum that is on display now for the public to see. It was incredible. I know your mother is watching virtually, and I'm sure your late father is also smiling down on all of us this evening. For those of you who don't know, Dick Goodwin served as both the Kennedy and Johnson White House administration, initiating JFK's Alliance for Progress and leading the Peace Corps, and serving as a special assistant to President Johnson, for whom he wrote the landmark "We Shall Overcome" speech in support of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. I had the honor of working with him when I was director at the Kennedy Library. He and your mother would often speak of you and your brothers, and to paraphrase the final lines of his memoir, he would have embraced the notion of your teaching as not imposing a guide on your students' future, but designed instead, as he so ably put it, to remind them to live as if the world is malleable to their grasp, and that, true or false, to live in that belief is to be most authentically alive. Or to use Robert's words, to live in that belief would be truly mind-blowing. I taught high school for the first 2 years of my career and can state candidly, it was the hardest job I ever had. What I remember most vividly were the scores of interactions I would have each day with my students and how careful I needed to be in each one. For lurking behind every exchange was the potential spark or diminution of their imaginations, the fragility of adolescence, the mystery of unknown challenges students might be facing in their personal lives. Late last week, in juggling too many work responsibilities, I made a small error in planning this event and got a bit ahead of myself. I thought I should let Michael know, and he replied promptly and kindly, reassuring me that he was sure it would all work out fine. My well-being is thankfully not as delicate as a teenager's, but you sensed a vulnerability, and your kind and calming response was, at that moment, just what I needed. The invariable mark of wisdom, Emerson reminds us, is to see the miraculous in the common. And like many teachers, Michael, your work in planning lessons, correcting papers, and interacting with and encouraging your charges is often done to miraculous effect. Let me close with a quote from Tracy Kidder's book, Among School Children, written after Mr. Kidder spent a year observing an elementary school classroom in Holyoke, Massachusetts. Teachers, Tracy Kidder writes, usually have no way of knowing that they have made a difference in a child's life, even when they have made a dramatic one. But for children who are used to thinking of themselves as stupid, or not worth talking to, or as deserving beatings, a good teacher can provide an astonishing revelation. A good teacher can give a child at least a chance to feel, he thinks I'm worth something, maybe I am. Good teachers put snags in the river of children passing by, and over the years, they redirect hundreds of lives. Many people find it easy to imagine unseen webs of malevolent conspiracy in the world, and they are not always wrong. But there is also an innocence that conspires to hold humanity together, and it is made up of people who never fully know the good that they have done. So tonight, Michael, we pause to recognize the good that you have done, the rivers of students who have passed through your classroom and whose lives you've touched, and the manner in which you have engaged their minds, hands, and hearts in the revolutions that define Concord's past. It is my honor now, on behalf of my colleagues and the museum's Board of Governors, to bestow upon you the 2020 Robert Gross Award for the advancement of Concord's history. You can clap.
Hi, everybody there. Hi, friends. Gosh, I'm just so honored and humbled. So thank you so much. And to be introduced by you, Tom, thank you. And I have so much respect for your work. And Bob, if you're there somewhere, you as well. And Maria Madison, I hope you know you're a dear and deep hero of mine, and the work that you've done here in the community. So thank you all for your kind introductions. So I love what I get to do. And pretty much every part of it. And I think one of the most powerful things that we get to do as a community is to, in the words of the artist Maya Lin, make the invisible visible, or take those stories that are below the surface and help to bring them to the surface and help to put them in our consciousness. Concord is a storied place with rich traditions and histories, and there's a lot of it that's been very present and visible for a long time. But there's many important stories that have been invisible. So the work that a lot of members of the community are doing, including Maria and others, and what we're trying to do in Rivers to bring the story, the Black story that is so rich here in Concord to the surface, the story of the Native peoples who lived here for thousands of years before we came, the story of women who are equally involved with the Transcendental movement but don't get the same airtime as Emerson and Thoreau and the others. And to me, there's really, at this juncture, there's nothing richer than that work of just bringing all these stories to bear so we can just have a clearer and more coherent picture of all the people who helped shape this place. And so when I think about the richness of Concord, I think about this. So this producer, Brian Eno, some of you might have heard me produce U2. He worked on a ton of music, he's an artist and a musician and a producer. And he uses this term scenius. S-C-E-N-I-U-S, scenius. He uses it instead of the word genius. And his argument is that, we tend to get so caught up in thinking there's like these individual brilliant people who shape history. And instead, it might do us better to think about this scenius, or this way in which there's this brilliance in a place and this ecology of ideas, and that it's a number of people and it's everyone contributing that gives rise to important change and important shifts in our community and in our society. And to move away from that idea of a solitary genius. And my gosh, that to me has been such a rich way of trying to understand and unearth the history which has been contributed to by every single person who's lived here. Right. And Thoreau actually says it really well in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. He says, we've had these amazing people here, but they never took to the way of writing like Chaucer or Shakespeare. Right. But they were out there harrowing the fields every day and carving their own story into the earth. And so what is it to really sort of, to look at history through that lens of equity and understanding that everyone who's been here has shaped the experience. And of course, it's not just the people, it's the place, right? This place is alive. Right? You go sit, I'm a little secret for everybody out there. Hey, go sit behind the old bands, all right? Sit on that rock that sits down right there by the river, all right? And just listen. And what you'll hear is that you'll hear ba-ba-ba-roo, ba-ba-ba-roo. So everyone's gonna try it. Okay, let's try it here, and we'll try it at home too, okay? So after me, ba-ba-ba-roo, ba-ba-ba-roo. At home, could we do it at home? Ba-ba-ba-roo. It's the spirit of the place that just courses through it. And when we stop and listen, there's so much to listen to, right? This place talks. And when we actually take the time to listen to it, there's so much to hear. So in the spirit of scenius, what I'd like to do is really essentially thank all the people that this award should be given to, because this award isn't just for me, it's for all the people who have helped shape this Rivers and Revolutions experience. So to the students, first and foremost, who have been the real, the active change agents in education and wanting to do something different, I thank you above and beyond, and have so much love and respect for the work that you've done in shaping this experience. I have some special friends here who have been involved with the work. So my friend Kim Parker is here tonight with her friend Erica. And Kim Parker is a brilliant soul and a brilliant educator and a tireless advocate for equity. And Kim was part of shaping the summer program, so I want to thank you for that. I would like to thank you, Melissa, for being an endless source of inspiration these past weeks, and for also just finding your way into the work, and you've helped me grow. My friend Peter McLean is here. I mean, a Concord legend. If you don't know Peter McLean, he's like the greatest R&B drummer in the world, and here he is. You've been my closest friend my entire life. It have informed everything that I've ever done. And I love you dearly. Thank you. He said he loved me too, for those of you at home. If you couldn't hear that, just to be clear. And then, you know, I want to thank all the teachers that have been part of this program too. So there's been about 10 teachers who have really been deeply involved, and they deserve this award just as much as I do. So I'd like to thank Tracy Dunn, Matt Goldberg, Jeff Fuller, Mary McCabe, Johanna Glazer, Ashley Cohane, Will Kameza, Mike Parado, and Jamie Andrade. And then finally, my dear friend who's here tonight, Peter Nickel with his wife, Leslie. And Peter is like, some of you probably know Peter, right? I mean, he is the environmental crusader of our community, and as such a crusader for us and our health and our well-being. And you have been the greatest mentor and friend to me. And I love you so dearly. And I thank you, and I'm ever grateful for you and our relationship and for what you've done for the work and for this community. So thank you for that. So that's all I got. I'm so grateful and so humbled, you know, so thank you so much. Thanks for coming to this event for those of you at home, and to my dear friends who are here, thank you so much for being here. And I guess all I ask of all of us is that we keep harnessing our collective wisdom and kindness to create some more coherence in the world and to help heal a world that at this juncture is very fractured. And I have absolute faith that it's something that all of us can do together, you know, ripples. So thank you so much. Much love to all of you. Thank you very much, Tom. Such an honor. Yeah. You can apply.
So thank you, Michael. You've given testament to us this evening of why you're so deserving of the support. So I'd like to invite our three speakers now to join us in this virtual setting if the technology works. You can all stay for another couple of minutes. And they will be introduced by our board president. As they do so, I hope you'll forgive me for shamelessly making the museum equivalent to a public radio or television pledge drive. But this evening happens to be the last night of the museum's fiscal year. And as you can imagine, like other museums and cultural institutions, we're doing our best to manage the loss of our core revenue stream since last March. So after the program concludes this evening, I've asked my colleague, Allison Schilling, who works tirelessly to produce these high quality programs, to send you all an email with a few links. First and foremost, there'll be a link to the pages on our website where you can make a one-time donation or become a member of the museum. And all gifts made this evening and through the end of the week will be credited to this fiscal year, and they'll go directly to support our educational programming and will be deeply, deeply appreciated. Second, there'll be a link to tonight's program, including the ceremony that we just watched. So if you wish to watch portions again or share the forum we're about to see with families and friends, you can forward that link. And third is a link to a video that we recently produced that focuses on one aspect of our work, the Paul Revere's Ride Fund, which provides free buses and field trips to students from Lowell Public Schools.
Oh, you can hear it now.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce another individual who's worked tirelessly over the past decade in overseeing the museum, its board, and its mission, our president, Ralph Earl. And Ralph, it looks like all of our speakers are joining us. So please go ahead and make those introductions.
Thanks, Tom, very much. And thank you, Michael, for your inspiring words. It's really quite moving to hear you talk about that as a former history major. I wish I'd had you as a teacher. But most importantly, thank you for your inspiring example as an educator and a leader in our community. On behalf of the Concord Museum's Board of Governors, I congratulate you and your colleagues on this very, very well-deserved honor. Ted Widmer's book, which we'll discuss in a minute, begins each chapter with a quote from Homer's The Odyssey. And we are fortunate that, like Odysseus, your life's journey has brought you back to serve as a dynamic teacher here in Concord, where you grew up. I wanted to underscore one of the hallmarks of your teaching and activism that has previously been mentioned and is increasingly important to my family and to me. That is your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In about a month's time, the museum will open 3 new permanent galleries to recount the events of April 1775, and to do so in a more inclusive way. As visitors enter the new main gallery, they will find a plaque.
What's happening?
That indicates the exhibit they are about to see is dedicated to the men and women of Concord and its neighboring communities who sparked the American Revolution. Both those whose lives are celebrated and others whose essential efforts often remain untold. So we thank you, Michael, for the work that you do with your students to engage them in those lesser known stories. And we invite everyone watching this evening to visit the museum after we open these spectacular new galleries in early November. It is now my distinct privilege to briefly introduce tonight's speakers, which I will do alphabetically, allowing me to begin with our hometown favorite, my neighbor and friend and Pulitzer Prize winning author, Doris Kearns Goodwin. Doris deserves special credit for getting here tonight. The building in which she lives and in which my wife and I live had a fire this afternoon. And while Jane and I are ensconced safely in New Hampshire, Doris was forced to evacuate. So Doris, thank you for joining us tonight. A presidential historian like no other, Doris has chronicled the lives of Lyndon Johnson, the Kennedys, the Roosevelts, and our subject this evening, Abraham Lincoln. As you likely know, her award-winning Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, was the inspiration for Steven Spielberg's Lincoln. The combined power of Doris's best-selling book and the Spielberg's Academy Award-winning movie recast the public's understanding of our 16th president and renewed our appreciation of Lincoln, much as the unveiling nearly 100 years ago of the marble cast created by another artist with Concord roots, Daniel Chester French, who sculpted the iconic statue in the Lincoln Memorial. Team of Rivals was awarded the prestigious Lincoln Prize in 2006, and Doris was the first historian to receive the Lincoln Leadership Prize from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. Speaking of the great statue on the National Mall, the last time Doris was at the museum was to attend a terrific talk given by our next speaker, Harold Holzer, on his recent book, Monument Man, The Life and Art of Daniel Chester French. Harold is considered by many to be the dean of Lincoln scholars and one of the country's leading authorities on the 16th president. The author of scores of books on Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era, one of which also won the Lincoln Prize. He served as chairman of the Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation and co-chaired the U.S. Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission appointed by President Clinton. President Bush awarded him a National Humanities Medal in 2008, and Harold is speaking to us from his home in Rye, New York. What prompts us to gather together tonight is an engaging new biography by Ted Widmer, Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington. Harold, in his review in the Wall Street Journal, described the books as, quote, magisterial, not only a historical achievement, but a literary one. Wholly original, gorgeously crafted in portraying Lincoln's demanding journey from Springfield, Illinois to our nation's capital as a Homeric odyssey. We are so pleased to have the book's author, Ted Widmer, with us this evening. I've been reading his fascinating historical travelogue over the past few days, and it can only add to Harold's acclaim. It is one of those books where one pauses every page or so to reread a sentence or a phrase simply because it is so well wrought. For example, in describing the purposes of Lincoln's journey, not just to the White House, but to the Emancipation Proclamation, Ted wrote, quote, would this country be free in keeping with the Declaration of Independence and its hymn to human rights? Or would it be a permanent slave society with no rights of any kind for the wrong sort of humans? Ted Widmer is a distinguished lecturer at the Macaulay Honors College of the City University of New York. He writes actively about American history for a number of national publications, from the New York Times to the New Yorker, and served as a speechwriter for President Bill Clinton. In his multifaceted career, he has taught or directed research centers at Harvard, Brown, and the Library of Congress, and Washington College. Ted is zooming in from his home in Providence, Rhode Island. Our moderator this evening is my colleague, Tom Putnam, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director of the Concord Museum. In a nod to Doris and hers and my shared love of the Red Sox, I'll use a sports metaphor in hailing Tom as the Theo Epstein, who has assembled tonight's dream team of historians for a conversation about Abraham Lincoln on the verge of the presidency. So without further ado, let's play ball.
Thank you, Ralph. And again, we're so pleased to have Ted and Harold and Doris on the phone. So Doris was going to be in a studio from her apartment, but unfortunately she's had to evacuate, and I'm hoping she can be unmuted, because Doris, I want to ask the first question to you. I should note first that I know Doris and Ted actually from my time working at the Kennedy Library, and a small Concord connection here. It should be noted that President Kennedy's mother, Rose, lived for 6 years at the turn of the century in West Concord. And in her saga of the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, Doris describes the family's trip every Sunday by horse and carriage from their home in West Concord to the Concord Center. And after the services, Rose would often visit the historic sites here in town, including the North Bridge and the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. We all know Rose Kennedy as the proud matriarch who was always encouraging and proud of her children's accomplishments. And Doris, we know you must be the same, having seen Michael win this award. And he is still here with us, with his friends. And if you want to say a word or two, we would welcome you doing so at this time.
Oh, thank you so much. Hello, everybody out there. I'm standing outside the Ritz-Carlton in my robe right now, as all of us are, waiting to be able to get up to get what we need out of the condos tonight to be able to go somewhere else to sleep. But I could not miss this night for my son, Michael. My husband, Richard Goodwin, who died 2 years ago, and I have been so proud of him throughout his career as a teacher. I think there's nothing more important, as he talked about, than learning the stories of our country. More important now than ever before for us to understand the history of this country, where it has had great ideals, where it has fallen short. And I know how Michael has done that. So to be here tonight and to wish that I were there with him, even in my bathrobe, I would be so glad to be so. You know, there are years in these last years when I've walked around Concord, and it used to be that people would say to me, "Can you talk to me about the Red Sox, or tell me about Abraham Lincoln, or tell me about Theodore Roosevelt?" But instead, in these last years, people would stop me on the street and say, "I want to tell you about your son, because your son taught my daughter, or your son taught my son." And that made me so proud. There's nothing more important than a teacher in this country who can create a sense of passion in a child. And Michael has done that with everybody he's taught. So I'm so proud to be there. Abraham Lincoln would be proud to know that the ideal that he espoused, which is that every person should be able to rise to the level of their discipline and talent, and that's what mobility in the society is worth, is being realized by Michael's Rivers and Revolution. So I'm so glad to be here tonight. I may have to leave you at a certain point because they're going to make us go up to our room, but I'll be here as long as I can. I'm so glad to be with my colleagues and with all of you. So go forth and start without me, and then I'll chime in whenever I can. But Michael, I love you. I'm so proud of you. You're a great man. Bye.
Thank you, Doris, so much. The story we're about to tell is one of peril and challenge, and you've exhibited that yourself by calling us after your being evacuated from your apartment. So I'm going to bid adieu to Michael and his friends. Enjoy. It's so wonderful to have you here. Before I launch into this conversation, I wanted to offer a couple of explanations related to this surfeit of historical riches that we've assembled here tonight. Our original invitation was to Ted to speak about his new book, Lincoln on the Verge. And then when I read Harold's glowing review, it seemed wise to include him, as he's been a very good friend to the museum over the past couple of years. And then Doris let us know she would be joining us for the ceremony honoring Michael, and she agreed to tag along too. So that said, I'm going to do my best to have the conversation follow Ted's book, the circuit of Ted's book. So forgive me if in the beginning Ted gets a few more questions at the start, and then we're going to weave Harold and Doris in as we can. We have a lot of ground to cover in an hour, but so I've asked our speakers to keep their answers brief. In this 1,900-mile trek, we literally have a lot of ground to cover. But Ted, let's start with you, and perhaps you can just tell us the premise of the book and why you decided to focus on these 13 days.
Absolutely, and I'm so honored to be here with you, Tom. We're old friends, and Harold and Doris, whose book was very important to me. And I should say also I'm an old friend of Bob Gross's, and I admire his scholarship tremendously. And I really feel like I'm among friends already. I always wanted to write a book about Lincoln. He's intimidating. He's been written about so beautifully by Harold and Doris and so many others. And yet I felt there were ways I could maybe add a little bit to the historical literature. And I was circling around this 13-day train trip in February of 1861, which is described in both Doris's and Harold's books. But I thought I could really drop down in a very immersive way and tell the story of a man in trouble, a man trying to keep his country together when it was falling apart, and trying to find basically a higher register, sort of a deeper way of talking about America to Americans at a time when nobody was agreeing very much what it meant to be American. I had no idea when I started the book 9 years ago that it would come out in another year when we were so divided, but somehow the story of this man trying to keep his country together assumed an even greater power as we got into the last couple years, and as it came out in April of 2020. It's very much a book about Lincoln. It's also a book about America and how many different places there are in this vast country. Even in a state like Ohio, there are huge differences between Northern Ohio and Southern Ohio. Pennsylvania, where Vice President Biden was today, is a state with probably 20 different regions. And I wanted to bring out some of that geographical diversity. There are a lot of kinds of diversity in our country. And I wanted to tell a story in the spirit of the old epics of Homer's Odyssey, which Ralph Earl mentioned, and Don Quixote, and John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And so I tried to tell a good story about a good man who kept acquiring knowledge, meeting Americans, feeding it back into his speeches, and then explaining to them why it was important to stay a single country. And in late 2020, that message feels more important than ever.
Great. Harold, since you wrote a review of the book, I noted that Doris opened her book, Team of Rivals, with a quote of Frederick Douglass in 1876 when dedicating a monument in Washington, D.C., erected by Black Americans to honor Abraham Lincoln. And Douglass, in that speech, said, "Any man can say things that are true of Abraham Lincoln, but no man can say anything new of Abraham Lincoln." But in your review, you seem to think that Ted is onto a little something here, and that you found some fresh insights. Tell us what it was that you liked about the book.
Well, you're absolutely right. I have written about the subject. Doris wrote about the subject in Team of Rivals. Ted brought new perspective to this journey in different ways, not only making it analogous to a Homeric journey toward destiny, toward a new home, his final home, as it turned out, Washington, D.C. But Ted did other things. He wrote about the scientific marvel, the technological marvels that were communications in the 1860s and transportation. Ted must be a secret, I know he's a secret baseball guy. And I am, because of Doris's troubles tonight, I am refraining from mentioning to all you Red Sox fans that I do believe that the New York Yankees are engaged in a playoff game as we speak. I won't mention that. Ted spoke about the railroad, the speeding railroads. One can almost feel a train slipping down a track in the winter, a track covered with ice-covered leaves that are making the track treacherous. So his ability to paint portraits of the evolving scenery, or the scenery passing by. I'm not sure Lincoln was terribly interested in place, as is Michael Goodwin and Ted and me perhaps, but he gives the reader a breathtaking ride. And I'll just say one more thing, in addition to those, the evocative way Ted presents the journey. We've known for years that Lincoln faced an assassination threat in Baltimore. It's been written about for 150 years. It was even a movie with Dick Powell as a detective trying to save Abraham Lincoln. And I thought that when I wrote my book, Lincoln President-Elect, I discovered that the plot had been known a bit before we earlier believed. But Ted has found the origins of this report of the threat to go all the way back to practically till a few weeks after Lincoln's election, which I think adds tremendously to our image of a man not only facing the peril of this journey in terms of politics, but the personal peril from the moment he left home. So it's a story of astonishing courage in addition to the other stories that Ted weaves.
Great. I'll ask another question to Ted, and then we'll see if Doris can chime in. So, Ted, in addition to being on this train, you write that, in essence, Lincoln was rewriting the political playbook, charming crowds with his humor, his modesty, his homespun way of speaking. He used the train as a mobile stage to speak in the open air and breathe new life into the Republic. Give us a little flavor of, and explain that he didn't actually campaign in the 1860 election. So this was really the first chance for many Americans to actually meet him.
Back then, the practice was to stay at home as if you were unaware that you had been nominated for the presidency, which of course is not true. But he stayed at home with great discipline, great message discipline throughout the summer of 1860. There was one moment in August when he was dragged out against his will and he spoke for about 30 seconds. And that is the only speech of the campaign of 1860 that the greatest orator in American history gave to become president. But what was so odd was then he won the presidency and basically had to campaign for popularity. Popularity is important when a country's falling apart. And he had to campaign after winning. So it was like a whistle-stop tour to become president, but he already had been elected. But so much was up in the air. The country was falling apart. The 7 states had seceded, 4 more would ultimately secede. And he had grave difficulties even within the Republican Party and certainly within the North at large, not all of which was Republican. And so he had to settle America with his various speaking skills, which were diverse and interesting. His ability to tell jokes, his ability to talk on serious policy matters, and then most interestingly, his ability to dive down very deep into American history, which is a topic of great interest at the Concord Museum, but to go back into the American Revolution and why ordinary citizens fought against a great military power and an empire to establish a comprehensible set of human rights for themselves. And he was extremely eloquent on that subject and why Americans went to war in 1775 and 1776. And by the end of the journey, he has become one of the best historians in America. And in a speech in Independence Hall in Philadelphia on the last day of the trip, even while he's receiving a great deal of incoming information about the assassination plot against him, he's talking about the Declaration of Independence and what it means for all Americans. And this is in the spirit of Michael Goodwin, not just those who could vote, not just white Americans and male Americans, but for all Americans. And he really was opening up politics in a very exciting way by the end of this trip.
So, Doris, are you still with us on that sidewalk?
Still here. This is perfect.
Oh, great. Well, I thought it might be a nice time for you. I've heard you speak so eloquently about kind of what surprised you when you met Abraham Lincoln anew, when you did your biography on Team of Rivals. And it seems parallel to how Americans were meeting him as he took this train ride. But what is it about his character that so fascinated and inspired you?
Well, if I might just say something about Lincoln on the Verge and the President-elect, they're just terrific books. And I think what Ted said about it mattering today in 2020 more than ever before, because as he traces the diversity of the country, the most important thing that we need right now is people in different sections of the country Wait, just excuse me. Yeah. Okay, great. They're calling they're going to be calling my floor in a minute. But if I may say that the important thing, Teddy Roosevelt warned that democracy would founder if people in different sections of the country began to think of themselves as the other rather than as common American citizens, not understanding the passions, the prejudices, and the hopes of different people. By Lincoln taking that train trip, by Lincoln having empathy from the time he was born, by what's described in both Harold and Ted's books, you see a man who understood the different feelings of different parts of the country, including the South and the North. And I think what surprised me most when I first met him, and I feel like I did meet him anew, just like people will meet him anew as they read these new books. He's so fertile for historians that 14,000 books have been written, and many of them are new because we want to live with him, because he makes us a better person. I kept feeling if I stayed with him longer, I would forget about envy or anger or jealousy, those emotions that fester within you. And he was able to use humor as a way of whistling off sadness. I had known he told funny stories, but I had no idea how much humor was a part of his leadership traits. I'm not sure I even fully realized what a political genius he was. I always thought he was a statesman, but he was a great politician. And in our world, which doesn't value politicians, to have that was so important. So I met this guy that I probably fell in love with. Then I fell in love with Daniel Day-Lewis. So it was 15 years of my life. I have to go right now and get my stuff, and I'll try and call you back in. But I'm so glad to be with my colleagues. The Lincoln Scholars are people who are generous with one another, and that's the great thing that Lincoln has given to all of us. I'll try and call you back after I get in to get my stuff before I go off to a hotel tonight. Bye, guys.
Right. Bye, Doris. Thank you. Never a dull moment here in quiet Concord. Ted, why don't you talk about the farewell address in Springfield? Let's get him on the train, and then I'm going to ask Harold how that address was covered by the press. But what was special about that farewell address to his friends and neighbors?
It's just such an interesting moment. It probably was only about a minute long, 1 or 2 minutes. And as I just said, he'd been quiet all summer. He'd spoken throughout the 1850s, but then as he became the nominee, he stopped speaking because of the understanding that nominees did not speak, although Stephen Douglas kept speaking that summer and fall. So when he gets on the train, it's a media moment, and no one quite knows what a media moment is. And by the way, I want to recommend Harold's new book, which is fantastic, which is about the history going back to the beginning of the presidency of presidents and the press. So Lincoln is just in a small town of Springfield, Illinois, on the back platform of a train that's about to pull away. But the people are crowded around him. And by the way, there were a lot of African Americans in that crowd. And he just started speaking from the heart with no paper in front of him about what it had meant to him to live among them. And he gave a beautiful speech that included his love of his neighbors, biblical concept, and his, quite a lot of religion actually, his feeling that if God was not with him, there was nothing much he could do. And if God was with him, there was not much that he could not do. But he said it in his characteristically terse way, not quite going to the extremes of religiosity, but just suggesting feelings that were inside of him. And then it was over, and the train pulled away, and this magical moment was a puff of smoke left behind the train. But then in this fascinating way that Harold and Doris know very well, in which the media is a co-actor in the presidency. A reporter named Henry Villard, a German immigrant, went up to him on the train's pulling away, and said, "Could you repeat that?" And Lincoln started to write what he thought he had said. And the train was moving, and in the original manuscript, which is in the Library of Congress, you can see the shaky handwriting. He handed it to John Nicolay, his secretary, who took dictation from Lincoln. And then they gave it to Villard, who telegraphed it back to New York, and it was a huge news story. Lincoln's parting words to his hometown, and it did a lot to settle things when things were very unsettled. It showed Lincoln as a small town man who loved his family and he loved his neighbors and was very far from the tyrant the South was already describing him as being. And it was just a remarkable moment of kind of unintentional media manipulation. I'm not sure they were doing it all on purpose, but it was a huge success as the journey was starting.
Great. So let's continue on that, Harold, for a moment, and I'll promote your new book too. The President versus the Press, the endless battle between the White House and the media, from the founding fathers to fake news. And you've written another whole book on Lincoln and the press. So on one hand, he's introducing himself along the way, but then these stories, so to the individuals who can see him, but then these stories are cascading out in various news outlets. Including the farewell address was in the front page of nearly every northern newspaper. At breakfast time, Ted writes, millions of Americans could digest it, and Lincoln's presidency became more real. So my question to you both for that speech, but throughout the inaugural journey, did the press praise his speeches and chats? Did they attack them, or both, and why?
So is this for me?
Yeah, that's for you.
Okay. Going back to the farewell address, I would just add, I'm going to put myself in the position of the journalist. Lincoln, and he traveled with not just Villard, but as Ted has written, a whole traveling party of press. Really, a whole car of his train was a press car. And the reason Villard got access is because he'd been covering Lincoln in Springfield for the New York Herald. So they were at that point pretty close. But Lincoln had told the press he wasn't going to speak, which is why nobody was taking it down. But his hometown newspaper had a stenographer in that crowd, in the drizzle, in the snowflakes that started to fall. And they telegraphed the first version of the speech, which is probably close to what Lincoln said. The astonishing thing about Lincoln's dictating a version of it on the train at Villard's request is that he improved it to such a degree. He was such a brilliant editor. And by the way, he's also has his inaugural address draft with him, which he's constantly fiddling with and improving all along this inaugural journey. He was a fantastic editor as well as a brilliant writer. As for the press reports, and by the way, I agree with Ted that the farewell address kind of escaped partisan coverage. It was just received as Ted remarks, as the first utterance from Lincoln, really since Cooper Union, exactly a year before the farewell address. So it's been 51 weeks since he's spoken publicly, a remarkable period of silence. But all along the inaugural journey, he is going to be giving charming little speeches that the press is going to jot down and report. You know, nice to see you, I've got to go, or I came to see you, you came to see me, and I got the better of the bargain. Or in Alliance, Ohio, by the way, where Joe Biden spoke today on his pre-election journey, probably on the same tracks, Ted would know, that Lincoln took. When Lincoln got to Alliance, Ohio, he said, I really can't stop to speak because if I spoke everywhere, I would get to Washington after the inauguration. But aside from the pleasant reports of those ditties, the press was partisan, openly partisan. Every town that he visited, especially the state capitals like Columbus and Harrisburg and Albany, had a Democratic paper and a Republican paper. And the Republican papers generally praised what he said, and the Democratic papers eviscerated what he said, especially when he started his speeches by saying there was not a real crisis, and then sort of changed his tune after that kind of a miscue. So all partisan coverage all along the way, something that Lincoln was used to in Springfield and Chicago and would continue to be subject to in Washington.
Harold, let's stick with you for a minute. Can you just set the backdrop for what's called the secessionist winter? What's going on in the South at this time while Lincoln's on the train?
So as Ted has said, 7 states have seceded, but more importantly, and Ted writes beautifully about this, Jefferson Davis actually commences his own inaugural journey to get to Montgomery, Alabama, the provisional capital of the Confederacy. And I think if Davis really was paying attention to the two journeys, as many Americans were, he would have realized from the start that a civil war was not going to go well for the South, because Davis, to get from his home to Montgomery, which is basically the distance between 2 points, he had to go up and down because the Southern rail infrastructure was not developed. Whereas Lincoln has different ways he can proceed. He can go the northern way. He can go through Indiana and southern Pennsylvania. So the railroad infrastructure is what's going to help win the war for the North. And too bad they didn't see it. Would have saved a lot of bloodshed in terms of the supply line. But that was the main thing, I think, the main alternative story, that Jefferson Davis is chugging along indirectly to his own inauguration and giving speeches along the way and being well received.
So Ted, you write about this race against time. There are assassination attempts. There's a fear that things won't go well in the Electoral College when the electors get together. But also you cast it in a larger, you often refer back to, as Lincoln did, to the Declaration of Independence and how Lincoln invoked it and the way Jefferson Davis saw the Declaration. Can you talk a little bit more about that spiritual competition between the two men?
Well, in many ways, Lincoln is behind Jefferson Davis. Davis is inaugurated on February 18th. Lincoln isn't inaugurated till March 4th. So Lincoln cannot stop Davis from starting the Confederate States of America. And Davis is a better known politician in many ways. He's extremely well known in Washington, which Lincoln is not. But one way in which Lincoln outmaneuvers Davis is he thinks not only more deeply about American history, but he establishes better media opportunities to put his vision of American history out there. So February 22nd, in the middle of this chaotic period, and we're beginning to go into some chaos right now, but in that other time, on February 22nd, it was the second most sacred holiday for Americans. It was George Washington's birthday. The 4th of July was the biggest holiday for Americans. And Lincoln and his team, and we don't know who exactly planned what, but you have to believe Lincoln was in on it, planned an appearance at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the Declaration and the Constitution were written, and gave a beautiful speech about the Declaration of Independence that foreshadows many of the themes that he will speak about at Gettysburg in the same state 2 years later. And Davis is silent on the same day. And Davis actually had his own claim to the American Revolution. He and his wife's family had been more involved in the fighting of the war than Lincoln's had been. And one could argue that the Declaration is an argument for the right of a people to secede. But Lincoln argued it was actually a thundering chorus of equality, in the words of Herman Melville, and that what was important were the human rights in the second paragraph. And so by forcing his version of American history out into the public as he's coming in to become the president, I think he did a lot to rescue human rights and idealism from a moment where all of those things were up for grabs and during which the Confederacy was trying very hard to say we're not a country that believes in the Declaration of Independence. We like prosperity, we like our big farms, we like our slaves, and leave us alone.
Harold, you're a deft politician and you worked for some. Surprised that you certainly didn't endear yourself to this Boston-based audience by promoting the New York Yankees this evening, but you are our resident.
I have to be true to myself.
You are a resident New Yorker. So as Ted explained, and you also mentioned, he could have taken a more direct route through Virginia, but he thought that was perhaps dangerous. And he wanted to take a more circuitous route to visit more. But he comes to New York City, and let's just take a step back. You've referenced the Cooper Union speech. So for those who don't remember the importance of that speech, I know you've written a book about that. Can you put that context and general, Lincoln's relationship to New York, and maybe we can have Ted talk about when he arrives on the train as part of this journey.
Yeah, because I think he was, I think both of us have written that the train he took from Albany down to New York City was about the plushest and most luxe of all of the trains. I just can imagine the wood paneling and the leather and the velvet. But he had been invited to speak in New York City in 1859, actually to speak in Brooklyn at the Plymouth Church, which still stands, Henry Ward Beecher's church. But he delayed his acceptance to kind of give more time, more space between his son Robert's departure for the Phillips Exeter Academy. So he agreed to be the last speaker in this series of Westerner orations in the Big Apple. Wasn't called the Big Apple then, but anyway, by the time Lincoln accepted, the venue had, the series was really over. So they moved the speech from Plymouth Church to this brand new coeducational school in Lower Manhattan called Cooper Union or Cooper Institute. And that's where he ended up speaking in a vast auditorium that still stands today in the basement of Cooper Union. Changed a bit, altered a bit, but not the pillars that blocked the view for many people looking at Lincoln on that very warm February evening. Not all the seats were filled, but he made a remarkable impression on the people he needed to impress, and that is Republicans who were dubious about their own favorite son, aspirant for the presidency, Senator William Seward, and about himself. It was as even Horace Greeley said, who was no big fan of Lincoln's. They had been at odds since their days together in Congress 10 years earlier. He said, no man ever made such a first impression on New York as Abraham Lincoln did. Mm. So then picture him a year later coming. By the way, New York City still voted about 69 to 31% against Lincoln for president. It was a Democratic town. So when Ted Widmer's Abraham Lincoln, president-elect, comes back to New York City, he's not just going to speak to Republicans. It's going to be, he's going to have to present himself to Republicans and Democrats. And I'll punt to Ted to tell that story.
Ted, tell us about his day in
That's
New
all
York.
so good. That's all absolutely right. And it's not just Democrats and Republicans. It's a place unlike any other in America. It's a city, when you combine Manhattan and Brooklyn, which were then different cities, has over 1 million people. What does Concord have at that time? It's just a place that's not like anywhere else in the United States. And Lincoln has to speak to enormous numbers of immigrants who are probably not committed yet to either party, to African Americans, to investors in Wall Street who are investing in the slave economy in the South, to representatives of shipping concerns who are deeply tied to the Southern economy. And it's a real hornet's nest for him, but he navigates it the way he does throughout this journey, with courage and improvisation. And there's some difficult moments. He had a meeting with the mayor of New York, Fernando Wood, that went pretty badly. Wood's a complicated character. He was thinking about pulling New York City out of the United States and making it a kind of free city like the cities of northern Germany, like Hamburg and Bremen, that had sort of certain forms of independence. Trying to think of a metaphor between the New York Yankees and Fernando Wood, and I can't quite come up with it. But just money, 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 no allegiance to any higher cause.
You know how to win the favor of
Rhode Island is far from perfect. Let me be very clear about that. But we do mostly like the Red Sox. There are a few. It's a very Italian-American state, and there's a nostalgia for the great Yankees of the 30s and 40s and 50s with DiMaggio and Yogi Berra and many other Italian-American stars.
Well, each team had a DiMaggio, but I think we should.
That's true.
Doris had it right for you guys. I think it's wait till next year was her book about the Dodgers, right?
And Ted, why don't you bring us to New Jersey? You make this lovely analysis or metaphor that like Washington crossing the Delaware. is
Tom,
where
could I
Lincoln-
just say, could I say one more thing about New York City?
Yeah, sure.
And you know, Ted writes with such an astonishing feel for place. And I was so moved by hearing Michael speak earlier about his kind of a tactile teaching method for teaching Concord history and Concord science. There are only a few places left in the country where you can see where Lincoln spoke. One is the depot in Springfield, which has been altered. Another, of course, is Independence Hall. He spoke in Independence Hall. Another is Trenton, New Jersey, the State House where he gave the speech that Ted alluded to earlier, and I'm sure we'll speak more on. But also City Hall in New York. He spoke not very eloquently there and had that difficult meeting with Mayor Wood, but Mayor Bloomberg restored that second floor reception room where Lincoln was feted by the mayor kind of icily, and then where he later lay in state. I just think it's a tour I'd like to make again when we can all get out and travel again to see these surviving places where he made such an impact.
I couldn't agree more. City Hall in Manhattan is a beautiful building and incredibly important in the green space in front of it, and then the former printing house row where the media was so important in the 19th century. It's an amazing place that is mostly bypassed by tourists, and Harold's absolutely right.
So Ted, bring us to New Jersey, where you have this metaphor similar to Washington crossing the Delaware. It's a bit Lincoln crossing the Rubicon. You see kind of a change in his kind of ethos or the way he's thinking about these issues.
Well, he gets into the State House in Trenton. He actually gives two speeches to the to the Assembly and then to the Senate. And he goes a bit into his childhood, which is unusual for Lincoln. He doesn't go there very often. And nowadays, to be a politician, all you do is talk about your favorite teacher in sixth grade and your paper route. And he didn't do that very often. But in that moment, he talked about reading stories about the American Revolution and reading about Washington crossing the Delaware, which we know from the famous painting. And that was a crucial gambit in a dark moment when the revolution was going very badly, a year and a half after April 1775 in Concord and Lexington. And by seizing the day, Washington, by crossing the Delaware, he restored a lot of vigor to the cause of the American Revolution. Lincoln talked about that and talked about how they must have believed in something more than just what would benefit themselves immediately, more than just prosperity, short-term profits, but a better way of living among each other as people in an egalitarian democracy in a way that might inspire all people for all time, which is a phrase he starts to use the next day. But he's in it for the long game of establishing democracy for all people on earth for all time, including our time in 2020. And it's a really interesting metamorphosis as he goes up to this higher level and starts to talk about that.
I always think it's interesting that it was a Democratic town as well, Trenton, and a Democratic legislature. And he starts by saying, I know you don't all agree with me. But the other thing I find remarkable about that visit is in those days, apparently they didn't have joint sessions. So Lincoln gave this high-minded speech to the state Senate, which included the phrases that Ted paraphrased here, but also went to the Assembly and said, we may be coming to the time in sectional affairs where I may have to bring my big foot down. And Lincoln raised his size 15 boot and slammed it down to the ground. And the audience sort of, was startled. So I think we saw a Janus-like speech or
That's
set of
right.
speeches by Lincoln that day, glory and power in that order.
That's absolutely right.
And Ted, I've heard you use the word that he wanted to perpetuate the Union. Why is that? Where does that word come from, and why is that important to you?
I actually don't remember using that word in particular, Tom, but he certainly did. The Union was a powerful concept, and it had been described in great detail by the heroes of his youth, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the great Whigs of the 1830s and 1840s. And then, as now, they were trying to work out the peculiar balance between a national government, and the national government was pretty weak, and states, governments, and states' rights. And he was on the eve of a struggle that not only ended slavery, as we know, but really restored the Union and gave the Union more power and gave the presidency more power than it ever had earlier in American history. So Lincoln's greatness is not just for what he did about slavery, which was profound, and I think we cannot say that enough in a time when his own statues are a bit vulnerable in a pretty contentious debate about our history, but about what the presidency should be, about how you elevate the American people and remind us that with all of our difference, we are one people. So he was doing a lot all at the same time.
Why don't we talk a little bit about how he gets through Baltimore? Harold, do you want to take the first shot at describing
Sure.
how he gets to Washington, D.C.?
I'll avoid the first shot metaphor, but he, as Ted writes, he was aware of a serious plot by pro-secession folks in Baltimore to prevent him from getting to Washington. And it was made possible, or it was taken seriously, because in those days there was no Amtrak, and when you arrived into a city like New York or Philadelphia or Baltimore, you had to leave the station and go to a station across town to proceed southward, usually on another line or another gauge track. We didn't quite have a united network of in our union in those days. So Lincoln was to be imperiled as he changed stations, and he got word of this. Certainly got final word from two sources in Philadelphia, from Alan Pinkerton, the soon-to-be legendary detective, a railroad detective at that point, and also from William Seward's son, who was sent up from Washington to convey an independent report about the threat. But the astonishing thing to me is that Lincoln exposes himself, so to speak, in front of Independence Hall the next morning, and gives a speech in the open air and raises a flag and says, "I would rather be assassinated on this spot than surrender it," which indicates not only that he cares deeply about Independence Hall and the threat to its legacy, but that he knows there's an assassination plot. But he also has promised the newly installed governor of Pennsylvania that he's going to appear at a dinner in his honor in Harrisburg. So the first thing he does before he goes to Washington is he goes to Harrisburg. And that's where the real fun begins. So I'll hand that off to Ted at this.
Okay.
Set you up for Harrisburg, Ted.
Well, Harold's understanding of the politics of this moment are so profound and so correct. And so, I mean, that is democracy. He's giving an inspiring speech at Independence Hall, and then he's got to go to a banquet for a pall. And there is intense infighting within the state of Pennsylvania about who's going to get what cabinet position. It's a huge headache for this guy. We want to just see him in the Lincoln Memorial, calm in marble. But he's dealing with a volatile political situation really every single day of his presidency and even before the presidency. And Pennsylvania was a mess. It's a mess in 2020, and it was a mess in 1861. And he's got to give someone a good cabinet position, because Pennsylvania not only delivered him the election, it really delivered him the nomination. It helped, as Harold knows, I mean, we're talking about Boston, New York tensions, but there were also Pennsylvania, New York tensions. Everybody hates New York because everyone's jealous of New York, because New York is fantastic. And so Pennsylvanians don't want a New Yorker to be the nominee. And so they sabotage Seward and they drift over to Lincoln, who's very happy to accept their help. But then he's got to give some complicated, semi-corrupt politician from Pennsylvania an important cabinet post.
Why don't we, I know, Ted, you want to talk about a Concord connection and Samuel Felton. Why don't you first tell us how Felton plays into this story, and then we could show the Concord map that you wanted to
I want to
show.
say I love Concord. I've been a million times, grew up in Boston and Providence, and just always been a great place to visit. My mother's first cousin, Marion Thornton, may be known to some people on the call. She was a nearly lifelong Concord resident and worked a lot to help Walden Pond and other causes. But as Lincoln was going into this vortex of danger, Harold just mentioned, he was warned by some really interesting people. Dorothea Dix, who's a female advocate for mental health from Massachusetts, picks up intelligence about the plot and goes to this guy named Samuel Felton, who's the head of the railroad from Philadelphia to DC through Baltimore, and says, you've got to protect Lincoln. They're going to try to kill him when he comes through Baltimore, as Harold said, crossing between the stations. By the way, the second station, the first station was called President Street Station. The one he was trying to get to was Camden Street Station. That's where we can agree a very inferior baseball team plays, not as good as either the Yankees or the Boston Red Sox. So she goes to this guy, Samuel Felton, who plays a very active role in saving Lincoln's life. He hires Alan Pinkerton. Pinkerton comes out with 8 agents, and they infiltrate the plot, and they get all the intelligence to save Lincoln. But Felton grew up in Massachusetts, and he had been working on railroads for a long time. And one railroad he put through was the one that goes through Concord, which is still the MBTA line. And if you have a map of Walden Pond, this is one of the most Concordian documents you could ever see. It's Walden Pond, a map created by Henry David Thoreau. And you see his house at the bottom. And in the upper right, there's a diagonal straight line. It's always been funny to me, the story of nature, immersion in nature. The guy was right next to a commuter train. You know, it wasn't that far away from civilization. And that train was put through by Samuel Felton, the same guy who saved Lincoln's life. And Thoreau wondered a lot about what the train meant. And he wrote in a very literary way about the train symbolized his destiny, or as he said, his atropos, Greek word for fate. And my reading of atropos is the final stop on the line. And so for Thoreau and for all of us, atropos means Fitchburg.
All right, let's get him. I'm not sure we fully got him through Baltimore. So how does he, Harold, why don't you, how does he get actually into Washington, D.C.?
By the way, all of Ted's ruminations about Felton and Dix were entirely new to me. I, read about this stuff for 50 years, and Ted uncovered just a trove of new connections. You have to promise me a chance later to talk about Concord myself, but I won't do it now. Baltimore. So he leaves Harrisburg without really telling his guests. The governor knows that he's doing it. Gets into a carriage with his longtime friend and bodyguard, soon to be appointed the U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia, Ward Hill Lamon. They speed off back to the depot. The train takes them back at night, back to Philadelphia. They change trains. They go south to Baltimore. By this time, Lincoln has put on something of a disguise. a Scotch cap, some his detractors say, but really just a soft hat, not like the stovepipe hat by which he's so easily identifiable in crowds because it renders him about 7 feet tall. He makes it to Washington D.C. in the early morning, and with Pinkerton and Lord Hill Lamon on that night train, avoids danger. But then, having made the choice to wear a disguise of sorts, I have a feeling Doris is joining us again from a busy locale. Having made the decision, he then has to endure a great deal of ridicule as he's subjected to caricatures that show him as a cowering, a coward, afraid of a black cat in one drawing, dancing the McLincoln Highland fling in a kilt and a feathered tam in another. And he's upset, of course, but he made the judgment. I think he made the correct call, because I'm more convinced than ever from reading Ted's book that the threat was genuine, and the passageway that he had to walk through was so constricted that I don't see how he could have been adequately protected unless people didn't know he was coming.
Doris, we welcome you back, and we've gotten Abraham Lincoln to Washington, D.C. So why don't you tell us?
If I could just, Tom, say one thing, because I'm on my way to the hotel now, where we were given 4 minutes to get our stuff out of the condo to go to the next place. But just listening to what I did before and knowing the value of those books, what the most important lesson that I think history can provide is that the people who lived through these difficult times, and the trip to Washington is an example of that for Abraham Lincoln, they didn't know how the story would end. We know now, looking back, that the Civil War ended with the Union restored and emancipation secured. We know now that the Great Depression came to an end when we mobilized for war. We know that World War II was won by the Allies, but they didn't know it. There's the anxiety, the fear, the disruption that they're feeling, which is what we're feeling now. So it seems crazy that we would take solace in learning about the Civil War, but somehow in knowing that this country came through the most disruptive time, having the people who were willing to sacrifice, and the Union soldiers and the people at home, and the leader, the right leader for the moment, has to make us feel that we can somehow get through this again. And somehow there's something about 2020 that has made this thing happen tonight. But I'm going to have to leave again in a moment. But I'm so proud of my two colleagues and what they've done. And I think what Ted said and what I repeated before, this is a book for our time. It's so important to read about these moments in history and to make us feel that these people, generations, our ancestors in the past, lived through probably more troubling times, certainly the Civil War, than ours, and somehow we emerged a stronger nation as a result. So let history give us lessons, perspective, and hope. And I think that's what this conversation, which I'm so sad to have missed tonight, I'm sure has made everybody feel. So we'll do this again sometime, my guys, you guys, Harold and Ted.
All right,
I'm
be
so
well,
glad to be on
stay
with you.
safe.
I will, hopefully. I'll be fine. We'll just be in another place tonight, and we had to get everything we could in 4 minutes from our place in order to get everybody up in the condos and get the stuff out. So good night, everybody. Have a good rest of the night.
Good night,
Thank you, Doris. We appreciate
I'll
your
talk to you
joining
soon
us.
again, everybody. Bye.
Okay.
High drama.
Exactly.
It's tough. Boy.
Why don't we conclude with the inaugural address? So he's, how many days is it before he, by the time he gets to Washington until the inaugural? Let's talk about that address.
It's 9 days.
Okay.
He gets to Washington. Is it the 24th or the 23rd, Ted? No,
23rd.
So it's 9 days. He goes to the Willard Hotel. Still a Willard on that site today. He goes to visit President Buchanan unannounced to get a tour of the White House, and gets to watch Buchanan run a cabinet meeting. So I guess the transition is a little friendlier than the one we're dreading in January, although he's waited 4 months for this. It's a long, long transition. And he works really hard on the inaugural address. And one of the things I'm proud of finding when I wrote my book is that he showed it to an extraordinary number of people to get their input, including Stephen Douglas, who was back in session in the Senate at that point, ready for the inaugural. And by the time he gets this manuscript, it is a mess. It's 18 or 19 pages of typeset speech with arrows, and he even draws a little finger to indicate where his place is. It's the only artwork by Abraham Lincoln that exists today, except for his doodles as a child. And Seward drafts a closing. This is too long a story, but Lincoln edits it as brilliantly as he edited his own farewell address. And then he gets, has to endure another threat, which is the inaugural parade, which in those days precedes the swearing in. It's the reverse of what we have today. Today we have the swearing in, the inaugural address, and the parade. Then we had the parade, the swearing in. I'm sorry, the parade, the inaugural address, and then the swearing in. So it's there are death threats even on Pennsylvania Avenue. Mm-hmm. And he gives what I think is a really underrated speech. I think it's one of his great speeches, even though its attempts to console and conciliate failed.
Harold, did you want a moment about Concord, and then I might give the last.
I just want to. I paid a few visits when I was writing my book about Daniel Chester French, and I fell in love instantly. Tom, your hospitality was part of that, the affection I still have for it. But, I wrote about the Minuteman statue and about the Melvin Memorial in the cemetery. Just astonishing, enduring works. I'm so excited that the museum is opening a new Daniel Chester French gallery, and I just hope health conditions are such that we can all visit soon and enjoy it. But congrats on doing that, and good luck with it.
So Ted, let's give the final word to you. It's really a very inspiring book, and I know I've heard you speak that you were personally inspired by Lincoln's faith and himself and the country. And why don't you just talk about that to close us out?
I was. There were all these ways I went against the grain of how historians are supposed to be. And I also want to say it's such a pleasure to listen to Harold talk about anything related to Lincoln, but just the way Lincoln drew a hand, and that it was his only artwork. That's true. I never thought of that before. It's so interesting. But yes, we're not supposed to be emotional people. We're supposed to be neutral social scientists, and we're supposed to be skeptical of national mythologies and greatness. And presidents don't do very well in the way historians are thinking inside of the academy right now. So what do you do about Abraham Lincoln? He's incredibly famous, and yet he's just radioactive, and he did not do well in the 1619 project a year ago, which I mostly enjoyed and admired. The passion of the writing was fantastic, but the way they treated Lincoln was not generous. It was the opposite of generous. It was showing him in a moment that was true, in which he was expressing skepticism that Black and white Americans could ever live together, and wondering if a group of Black dignitaries might want to consider colonization for their people. But in that very moment, he was, in a Lincolnian way, ushering in probably the most sweeping legislation in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation. It was already underway. He had already told his cabinet he was going to do it, and he did it. And this complicated man with so many contradictions is moving, even in a social science. He's a kind of emotionally inspiring role model for all of us still to this day, as our country threatens to fall apart all over again. And his qualities of personal courage and physical courage, going through a city where he might be assassinated and standing up in front of huge crowds of Americans when anyone might have pulled out a gun or a knife and done him grievous bodily harm. And especially his sense of ethics at the core of who he was, knowing who Americans had been, what they had been through in the American Revolution, beginning at Concord Bridge, and how they had accepted so many different kinds of people and were daily showing the rest of the world what a democracy could be. And when I think about a human being like that, I'm not a neutral scientist, social scientist. I'm an emotional admirer of a hero. And so those aren't words that historians use very easily, but I felt them. And the more I spent on this book, and I spent a long time, I spent more than I meant to, the more I felt gratified to come to someone who had such a strong moral grounding. And if Concord, in a way, is the grounding of the American Revolution, Lincoln is a second grounding. And we need to go back to our heroes to get through a difficult time in 2020.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. I want to thank Harold, Ted, Doris from the sidewalk, all of you for watching. I'll echo Doris that he was a man who united our country through the most divisive moment in our history, it's a moment that we can all hearken back to and can unite us during these very divisive times. So we thank you all for coming. Again, my colleague Allison will be sending out a email. So if you enjoyed tonight's program, please forward it along to others. Consider making a donation to the museum. And we hope you will join us again next Wednesday. We have a forum looking at Native American history here in the Commonwealth and the King Philip's War. So we hope you will join us for that program. Thank you all.